Just after midnight on December 4th, 1966, a sentry dog named Nemo caught a scent at Tan Son Nhut Air Base that no human guard anywhere along that perimeter had noticed at all. Nemo was a German Shepherd paired with a young Air Force handler named Robert Thornburg, walking a routine patrol along a fence line that guarded one of the busiest and most important airfields in the entire country. The night was quiet, the way most nights on perimeter duty were quiet, and nothing in the hour before had given either dog or handler any reason to expect what was coming. Then Nemo alerted, hard, ears up, body rigid, staring into the darkness beyond the wire with an intensity his handler had learned to trust completely. What Nemo had smelled, and what no man on that perimeter had seen or heard, was a Viet Cong sapper force preparing to breach the base in numbers large enough to threaten the aircraft, and the operation being staged from it. Thornburg radioed the alert immediately, and within moments, the quiet night became a firefight. Dozens of VC fighters pressing against a defense that had, until Nemo's alert, no idea they were coming at all. In the fighting that followed, Nemo was shot in the face, wounded badly enough that any onlooker would have expected him to go down. He did not go down. He stayed between his wounded handler and the enemy fire, refusing to move until help finally reached them both. Nemo survived, though he lost an eye, and the men who fought that night credited him, plainly and without exaggeration, with saving lives that would otherwise have been lost to a threat nobody had detected in time. He became one of the most famous dogs of that entire war, and one of the very few ever brought home again once his service ended. But Nemo's story, remarkable as it is, was not unique in what it revealed. It was simply the most visible example of something the Viet Cong tried over and over for years to defeat and never quite managed to. That is the story of the war dogs the enemy could not fool, no matter how hard they tried. Now let me show you exactly what they attempted, and why none of it worked. If a story like this matters to you, if the men and animals who lived it deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why the Viet Cong never solved the problem these dogs presented, you first have to understand exactly what a trained dog could sense that no human soldier on either side ever could. To understand why the dogs proved so difficult to defeat, you have to understand the basic biological advantage they carried into every patrol and every perimeter watch, an advantage no amount of human training could replicate. A trained scout or sentry dog detected the world through a nose built on a scale that dwarfed anything a human being possessed. A human nose carries somewhere in the range of 5 million scent receptors. A German Shepherd, the breed most widely used by American forces in that war, carries something closer to 225 million. That is not a small advantage, refined at the margins. It is a difference in kind, not degree, and it meant that a trained dog could detect a human presence, sweat, breath, the specific chemical signature of a man's body from distances and through concealment that made human observation completely irrelevant by comparison. Add to this a dog's hearing, capable of detecting sound from roughly 4 times the distance a human ear could manage, and you begin to understand why these animals became, in a very real sense, a sensory system no enemy soldier could see coming, and no enemy soldier could fool through concealment alone. Picture what this actually meant on an ordinary night before anything dramatic had happened at all. A dog and handler walking a perimeter that looked, to any human eye, completely undisturbed. No movement, no sound a person could pick out. And yet the dog's head turns, just slightly toward a stretch of darkness 100 meters out, because some faint trace of scent has reached it that no man standing in the same spot would ever have noticed. The handler learns over months of working together to read that small movement the way he would read a shouted warning, because he has seen it prove correct too many times to doubt it. That trust was not automatic. It was built deliberately through months of training before either dog or handler ever set foot in Vietnam, pairing men and animals together at training centers where the two learned to read each other's smallest signals long before their lives depended on getting that reading right. A handler learned the particular way his own dog's ears shifted for a genuine alert versus simple curiosity, the difference in body posture between mild interest and real danger, distinctions invisible to anyone outside that specific partnership, but as clear as language to the two who had spent months building it together. This was, in its own way, as demanding a form of training as any human soldier underwent, requiring patience, repetition, and a kind of interspecies fluency that could not be rushed or faked. This sensory advantage translated directly into battlefield value across several distinct roles. Scout dogs led infantry patrols, walking point ahead of the lead man, trained to alert on booby traps, ambushes, and hidden enemy positions before any human in the patrol could detect them. This made the scout dog's position one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war, carrying, by some accounts, among the highest mortality rates of any role a soldier could hold, precisely because the dog and its handler walked first into whatever danger existed ahead. Sentry dogs, like Nemo, guarded the perimeters of air bases and installations, providing an early warning system against infiltration that no static human guard force, however alert, could fully replicate. Specialized tracker teams, trained on a British model developed during the Malayan emergency, worked to re-establish contact with enemy forces that had broken away from combat, a persistent tactical problem that had frustrated American commanders for most of the early war. Every one of these roles depended on the same fundamental fact. A dog's senses operated on a different, and in most respects superior, register than a human soldier's, and that difference could not be trained away, disguised, or argued out of existence by an enemy who had, until these dogs arrived in real numbers, enjoyed real success exploiting exactly the sensory limits of human observation alone. The Viet Cong understood, quickly and clearly, exactly what a threat these dogs represented, and they responded the way any capable adversary responds to a serious new problem. They tried repeatedly and with real ingenuity to find a countermeasure. The most direct attempts targeted the dog's core advantage: scent head-on. Viet Cong fighters experimented with a variety of methods intended to mask their own human odor, hoping to slip past a dog's detection the way they had once, with real success, slipped past human observation alone. Pepper was one substance tried, scattered or applied in the hope that its strong smell would overwhelm or confuse a dog's ability to distinguish human scent from the surrounding jungle. A garlic-like herb, known locally as toy, was tried for the same reason, on the theory that its powerful, distinctive odor might mask or disguise the specific chemical signature a trained dog had learned to recognize. Neither approach worked reliably. Trained dogs continued to alert on human presence despite these attempts, and accounts from that period describe these countermeasures, tried repeatedly, as failures the Viet Cong could not solve through scent masking alone. Picture the actual moment one of these attempts failed, because it must have happened again and again in slightly different forms across the length of the war. A group of fighters coated in pepper or the sharp, sweet reek of toy, moving carefully through cover they believed would hide them completely. A dog's head lifting anyway, unmoved by the competing smell, alerting its handler with the same certainty it always showed. The men on the ground had done everything their limited resources allowed. It was not enough. And they likely never fully understood why, because the failure was not a matter of insufficient effort. It was a matter of trying to solve a problem with tools that were never going to be capable of solving it. Understanding why these attempts failed requires understanding something about how a dog's detection actually functioned, because it was not the kind of simple, single-note signal a masking agent could easily overwhelm. A trained dog was not searching for one specific, isolated smell that a stronger competing odor could simply drown out. It was detecting a complex, layered signature: sweat, breath, the residue of food and equipment, the simple biological fact of a warm human body moving through cooler jungle air that no single masking substance, however strong, could fully erase or replace. Pepper might irritate a dog's nose temporarily, and toy might add a strong competing smell to the air, but neither eliminated the underlying signature. The dog had been trained through months of careful conditioning to isolate and recognize even amid other competing odors. When scent masking failed to solve the problem, the Viet Cong shifted toward a more direct and considerably darker approach, recognizing that the dogs themselves and the handlers who worked with them represented a specific and serious threat. Viet Cong units placed bounties on killing both, treating a dead scout dog or sentry dog as a genuine, valuable objective in its own right, worth deliberate, planned effort to achieve. Kennels housing these dogs became specific targets, including at least one documented mortar attack aimed directly at a kennel facility, an attack that makes sense only once you understand how seriously the Viet Cong had come to regard the threat these animals posed to operations that had once moved with much greater confidence and safety. Picture the calculation behind an attack like that, because a mortar strike on a kennel is not a decision made lightly or without real strategic reasoning behind it. Every round spent on that target was a round not spent on a more conventional military objective, and the Viet Cong commander who ordered it had concluded, based on hard experience, that the dogs housed there had cost his side more operations, more casualties, and more failed infiltrations than almost any comparable target he could have chosen instead. That is not the reasoning of an enemy dismissing a minor nuisance. It is the reasoning of an enemy who had tried everything else, found none of it sufficient, and concluded that direct destruction was the only remaining option left to him. It is worth pausing to understand in specific and honest detail exactly why an enemy this capable, this adaptive, and this successful against nearly every other American advantage in that war could not solve the problem these dogs presented, because the reasons reveal something important about the actual nature of the advantage involved. Most of the technological and tactical advantages American forces held in that war were, in some meaningful sense, things that could eventually be studied, understood, and countered. Given enough patience and enough captured material to examine, a captured radio could be taken apart and its vulnerabilities identified. A captured weapon could be analyzed and its limitations mapped. A dog's nose offered no equivalent point of technical entry. There was no circuit to trace, no mechanism to reverse engineer, no captured example that could be disassembled on a workbench to reveal a weakness a patient engineer might exploit. The advantage lived inside a living, trained animal's biology, refined over months of conditioning that reinforced instincts already present in the breed, and there was no comparable countermeasure available to an army with the industrial and technical resources Viet Cong units actually possessed. This did not mean the dogs were invulnerable, and it would dishonor the real danger these teams faced to suggest otherwise. Scout dogs and their handlers, walking point ahead of every patrol, absorbed real and serious casualties throughout the war, targeted deliberately once their value became clear. But the vulnerability that existed was a vulnerability to direct violence, not to cleverness or technical countermeasure. You could kill a dog with a bullet. You could not fool its nose with pepper, and you could not disguise a human body's basic chemistry with a strong-smelling herb. No matter how many times you tried the same approach with a different concentration or a different combination of substances, think about what this meant for a Viet Cong unit operating in an area where these dog teams were active. Every other advantage American forces held in that war had at some point met a real and often effective countermeasure. Tactics adapted, technology studied, patterns eventually broken. This particular advantage never quite met one, and units that had grown accustomed to finding a workable answer to nearly every problem the war presented found themselves, in this one specific respect, simply unable to solve it through anything short of killing the dog outright, an option that was itself dangerous, difficult to execute reliably, and never fully closed the gap these teams created. The value these teams provided was not an abstract or theoretical advantage. It showed up in real, measurable outcomes across thousands of patrols and thousands of nights of perimeter security throughout the length of the war. Scout dog teams leading infantry patrols detected an enormous number of booby traps and ambush positions before American units walked into them, converting what would have been sudden, costly contact into a controlled, prepared engagement instead. A patrol with a scout dog walking point had genuine warning, often measured in the crucial seconds and minutes that separated a survivable ambush from a catastrophic one. Warning that came from a sense no human point man, however experienced and alert, could fully replicate on his own. Units that operated with these teams came to trust them completely, understanding that the dog's alert, however subtle, represented information worth acting on immediately rather than questioning or second-guessing. Picture the specific relief on a patrol when that trust paid off. A dog stops dead still, staring at a stretch of trail that looks, to every man behind it, completely ordinary. The patrol halts. A careful search finds a hidden booby trap exactly where the dog's attention had been fixed, a device that would have caught the lead man within another few steps if the patrol had simply kept walking. Nobody in that patrol needed convincing about the dog's value after a moment like that. They had watched directly the difference between a routine patrol and a catastrophe, decided by a sense none of them possessed. Sentry dogs, in their own domain, provided a similar and equally valuable service, protecting air bases and installations against the kind of infiltration attempts that had, before their deployment in real numbers, caused genuine damage and real casualties. The story that opened this script, Nemo's detection of an infiltration force that no human guard had noticed, is a specific, vivid example of a pattern repeated in smaller and less dramatic form across countless nights on countless perimeters throughout the war. The dogs did not eliminate the threat of infiltration entirely, and determined, well-planned attacks still sometimes succeeded despite their presence. But the baseline of security these teams provided night after night represented a real and substantial improvement over perimeter defense relying on human senses alone. Combat tracker teams, working further from any base perimeter, provided their own distinct and equally valuable service. When an American unit made contact with the enemy and that enemy broke away into the jungle, the trail often went cold within minutes for a human patrol working without a dog, the ground giving up no obvious sign to eyes untrained in tracking. A tracker team with a Labrador retriever moving quietly ahead could follow a scent trail hours old through terrain that offered a human tracker almost nothing to work with, re-establishing contact with an enemy force that believed reasonably that it had already made a clean escape. This capability solved a problem that had frustrated American commanders for years, and it did so using the same fundamental advantage this whole story has described: a nose capable of following a trail no human eye could see at all. And it is worth being honest about what this cost the dogs and the men who worked with them, because the danger these teams faced was genuine and constant. Scout dogs, Walking Point, absorbed real casualties in exactly the positions that made them so valuable, and their handlers, working in close partnership with an animal whose life and their own were bound together by the nature of the job, faced the same dangers their dogs faced every single patrol for the length of their service. This was not a safe or comfortable assignment. It was one of the most dangerous jobs available in that entire war, chosen or assigned to men who understood from the very beginning exactly what the position demanded of both the human and the animal doing it. It would be dishonest, and it would betray the respect these animals earned through years of genuine, life-saving service to end this story without confronting what happened to most of them once the war itself came to an end. The overwhelming majority of American military working dogs that served in Vietnam were never brought home. Official policy for most of the war and its aftermath classified these animals as surplus military equipment rather than as veterans deserving of the kind of consideration given to the human personnel who had served beside them. When American forces withdrew, most of these dogs were left behind, transferred to South Vietnamese forces of uncertain capacity to care for them, or in many documented cases, euthanized outright rather than repatriated to the country whose soldiers they had spent years protecting. Of the thousands of dogs that served across the length of the war, only a small fraction, a few hundred, by most accounts, ever returned to the United States. Picture what this actually meant for a handler nearing the end of his own tour, faced with the reality of that policy for the first time. He had spent months, sometimes a full year, in the closest possible working partnership with an animal who had, in many cases, saved his life directly more than once. He now learned, often with real shock, that he would be going home without that partner, that the dog beside him was, in the plain language of military property regulations, equipment to be disposed of rather than a fellow soldier to be brought home. Many handlers fought this decision as hard as they could through whatever channels were available to them, and most of those fights failed, leaving men to board transport home without the one partner who had shared every danger of their entire tour. This is a genuinely difficult piece of history to include in a story built around celebrating what these animals accomplished, and it deserves to be included anyway, because leaving it out would tell only half the truth. Nemo, the dog whose story opened the script, was one of the fortunate exceptions, brought home and given a place of honor for the remainder of his life, specifically because his actions had become too publicly celebrated to leave him behind the way so many others were left. Most of the dogs who performed comparable service, whose noses saved comparable numbers of American lives across comparable years of comparable danger, received no such consideration. They were, by the plain, bureaucratic logic of military property classification, equipment to be disposed of rather than veterans to be honored. And that classification, more than any Viet Cong countermeasure, is the part of the story that actually succeeded in defeating something these dogs deserved. This honest reckoning matters because it completes the story rather than undermining it. The dogs themselves were never outsmarted in the specific and narrow sense this title describes. No enemy countermeasure ever solved the sensory advantage they carried into every patrol and every perimeter watch. What ultimately failed them was not Viet Cong ingenuity, which tried and failed repeatedly to defeat them on the battlefield. It was a policy decision made far from any battlefield that treated animals who had performed genuinely heroic and life-saving service as disposable property once their usefulness to an ending war had run its course. Thornburg carried the memory of that December night for the rest of his life, and in the years afterward, he thought often about what his own survival and the survival of the men around him had actually depended on. He came to understand with time that the specific narrow margin between a controlled engagement and a catastrophic surprise attack that night had rested entirely on a sense he did not possess and could never have developed no matter how alert or well trained he had been. Nemo had not simply performed a trained behavior correctly, he had detected something real, something dangerous, something that would have reached the base's perimeter undetected if the dog beside him had not been capable of sensing a threat. No human guard anywhere along that fence line had noticed at all. That was not luck, and it was not a fluke of one especially gifted animal. It was the ordinary, reliable function of a sense every trained dog on every perimeter that night carried into their work, night after night. Whether or not that particular night ever produced a story anyone would tell. He thought, too, about what Nemo's own actions after being wounded revealed about the bond these teams actually represented, something that went beyond the purely tactical value the story has otherwise described. A wounded animal, badly hurt, had chosen to stay between his handler and continued danger rather than retreat to safety, a choice that could not be fully explained by training alone, however thorough that training had been. Thornburg came to believe, in the years that followed, that something real had passed between the two of them in that moment, a loyalty that training could shape and reinforce, but never fully manufacture on its own, and he carried a debt for that loyalty that he tried, for the rest of his life, to find adequate ways to repay. And he came, eventually, to a difficult clarity about the dogs who had not been as fortunate as his own partner. He knew men who had served with equally capable, equally devoted animals, dogs who had performed service every bit as valuable as Nemo's, and who had been left behind or destroyed once the war ended, their service reduced in the final accounting to a line item on an equipment inventory rather than a record of genuine heroism. He never fully made peace with that fact, and he did not think he was supposed to. Here is what the story of these dogs actually reveals, and why the Viet Cong's repeated, genuine, and ultimately unsuccessful efforts to defeat them matter beyond one wounded animal's famous night at Tan Son Nhut. For most of that long war, nearly every advantage either side held eventually met a real and often effective countermeasure. Weapons were studied and countered. Tactics were observed and adapted to. Technology was captured and understood, its vulnerabilities mapped and exploited by patient, capable adversaries on both sides of a conflict that rewarded exactly this kind of adaptive intelligence. The sensory advantage a trained dog carried into every patrol and every perimeter watch was different, and it stayed different for the entire length of the war, because it was never a technology or a tactic in the ordinary sense. It was a biological fact refined by training, but never created by it, that no pepper, no herb, no clever countermeasure ever managed to defeat. That is the real meaning behind the failed attempts this story has described. The Viet Cong were not a careless or unsophisticated enemy, and their repeated efforts to solve this particular problem, trying, adjusting, trying again, reflect exactly the same careful, adaptive intelligence that succeeded against so many other American advantages across that long war. They failed here not for lack of effort or ingenuity, but because the thing they were trying to defeat had no circuit to trace and no mechanism to reverse engineer. It simply worked the way it had always worked, refined over generations of careful breeding and months of careful training into a sense no countermeasure available to that era could touch. And notice, finally, what happened to that advantage once the war itself ended, because it completes the story in a way that has nothing to do with the enemy at all. The dogs were never outsmarted on any battlefield. They were, in the end, simply left behind by the same bureaucratic logic that classified them as equipment rather than veterans, a fate no Viet Cong bounty or mortar attack had ever managed to inflict on them directly. Nemo lived out his years as a celebrated exception, a single dog whose fame bought him a homecoming most of his fellow soldiers on 4 legs and 2 never received. Nemo caught a scent in the dark that no human guard along that entire perimeter had noticed, and in doing so, he likely saved lives that a Viet Cong sapper force had every intention of taking that night. He was shot for it, and he stayed anyway between his handler and the danger until the fighting was over. That is the story of the combat dogs the Viet Cong could never outsmart, no matter how many times they tried. The only thing that ever truly defeated them was the war ending and a decision made far from any battlefield that they had already given enough. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, 4-legged partners who walked point, guarded the wire, and asked for nothing but loyalty in return on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a dog handler, a scout, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and the animals beside them carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.